Welcome everyone to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today's Thursday, June 17th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story high-rise that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds, in the afternoon of 9/11, 2001. Before we get into it, though, let me introduce you to our operations manager here at AE 9/11 Truth and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Mr. Andy Steele. Andy, how you doing?
Hi, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is to go to the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. Just select continuing education and then the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. I'll also be looking at the YouTube broadcast and the Facebook broadcast of today's webinar for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard's going to be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
And thank you, Andy. And there he is in the flesh, Andy Steele. You got to see his show every week, every Thursday without fail. He's coming out with more evidence, more exciting speakers. It just doesn't get much better than that. But just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching into this full-time effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others as to what happened on this auspicious day of 9/11. And we begin with World Trade Center Building 7. Did you know about it? Most architects and engineers don't even know that a third tower collapsed on 9/11. Why? Well, the American Institute of Architects, of which I'm one of 90,000 members, did not issue one bulletin on this, the third worst structural failure in modern history, after the Twin Towers. Not one. And a similar set of disinformation and misinformation and non-information from the American Society of Civil Engineers, the two major societies for architects and engineers in our country. I mean, here's a 47-story skyscraper, would be the tallest building in most of our states, and 610 feet tall. Easily confused, perhaps, as to its height next to the impressive Twin Towers, which were the tallest buildings in the world at the time they were built. But nevertheless, an incredible building. Each floor was an acre in size. It's part of the World Trade Center complex, officially, just outside the super block of the World Trade Center, as you see here. It was about 100 yards north of the North Tower. And let's call that northeast. And you can see it still standing here even after the Twin Towers came down. It did have some damage attributed by NIST to have no significant impact on the collapse of the building. And we'll get into that, but let's take a look at the collapse of this building now. And then we'll get into its details. The east penthouse collapses first. And that's the mechanical penthouse. And in 6 seconds after that, the entire building comes straight down into its own footprint, as we'll see. So we're going to break this down. First, let's look at the official story as promoted by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Here's Shyam Sunder, the project leader.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Fires. Fires like these that are actually few and small and scattered, as you can see. These are the only photographs and videos that we have of these fires. And they are problematic for the official story. We'll go into that. The first point to make here is that the fires, even by 3 p.m., are moving from the west, from the east to the west, to the right here, which is away from the area of concern, which is column 79, according to NIST, because it is, after all, underneath the east penthouse, mechanical penthouse, which did collapse first. And so it's rational to have them pursue that line of hypothesis to verify. And so they do that first with fire simulations, which show the fire on the south side, which is close to the North Tower. And those fires developing about 2 o'clock and then moving and expanding by about 3 o'clock on this floor 12, and then hovering around column 79 from 4 p.m. until the time of the collapse, almost an hour and a half. They show these fires in that area because that is their main hypothesis, as we'll see. But they also acknowledge, on the other hand, ironically, that fires didn't persist in any one location for more than 20 or 30 minutes, which is the conventional thinking of fire protection engineers and borne out by tests. And that directly conflicts with their collapse, with their fire simulations. So also conflicting with their simulations are the reality of the fires themselves, which are shown to be burned out on the 12th floor, the area of concern of NIST, by 3:50 p.m., more than an hour and a half before the collapse. So we have done our own fire simulation at 8911 Truth, which shows indeed the fire is burning at 2 p.m. in the southeast section of the building, and then moving over to the east section as shown by the photographs. And then moving on by 4 p.m., they've moved on to the west end. And that's shown by the photographs too. And by 5 p.m., more than 20 minutes before the collapse, there is no fire on this floor at all, as shown in the photographs as well. So this is only the beginning of the problems for NIST that they have yet to answer to. But let's listen anyway.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
So their theory, their hypothesis is fire-induced progressive collapse. And yet the fire causing thermal expansion was out over an hour and a half before the collapse. Thermal expansion requires expansion during the collapse, which requires fire during the collapse. This has been shown not to happen now. But let's go on.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
Thermal expansion. Let's break this down. NIST is telling us that the fire that was raging up until the time of the collapse on this floor 12 caused these long span beams to expand, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column number 79, causing floor 13 to fall on 12, 12, and 11, and so on for 9 floors when there's no support for that column at all, and it buckles, and the entire inside of the building is caved in, and that instability then travels laterally within 6 seconds across the building, and the whole building is then gutted, and then the overall collapse happens. That's the official story here, their collapse hypothesis in a nutshell. Let's break it down further, because there's still a number of problems associated with the rest of this story. First of all, there's fireproofing on these columns. They're not going to be heating up. This is a 2-hour fire protection on these beams. There's only fire 20 or 30 minutes, even as NIST acknowledges, in any one given area. That fire protection keeps the beams from heating up and failing. So they're not going to be expanding. Even if they couldn't push this girder off of its seat, because that girder is tied to the concrete floor slab up above with 30 shear studs that NIST conveniently omitted from their structural model so that they could get that girder to slide sideways. But even if it could slide sideways, it could not have fallen off of this seat. Why not? Because the seat is 12 inches wide. The beam would have had to have slid all 12 inches off of that seat. But the beam could only slide 5 or 6 inches. That's all the expansion capability it has under the worst conditions. By the way, the NIST put all of the heat, 1400 degrees or so Fahrenheit, into those beams in a second and a half in their computer model, forcing it to expand, whereas naturally it would have sagged, as you'll see in an upcoming video. But NIST had to conveniently ignore some key structural components, these 3/4 inch thick stiffeners, which are welded to the web, the eye of the I-beam, and the flange, the bottom and top parts, in this case, just the bottom. So that girder would have indeed had to have been pushed all 12 inches off of its seat. NIST says, oh no, it only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat, at which point the flange folded. Well, the flange couldn't have folded, but because of these stiffeners that are welded to it. This has been shown in many different ways by structural engineers. NIST says, oh, we didn't have to use those stiffeners because they're only there to prevent web crippling. Well, they also prevent the flange from folding. They conveniently omit that fact too. But even if all of that could have happened and we would have had the 13th floor falling on the 12th, it couldn't have actually fallen on the 12th because there's 2 other massive girders that are connected to that column as well. They would have had to have been unseated as well. But let's say somehow they did. And this floor 13 did fall on 12. Could it have generated the necessary force to break the connection down below the 12th floor? No. In fact, it had 10 times less than the dynamic force required to break those connections down below. Would have required 632,000 pounds of impact force. But it only had 60,000 pounds. So it couldn't even have started the progressive collapse that NIST claims brought this building down. So even if all of that could have happened, if you had an interior cascading collapse from the full height of this building and the full width of this building, don't you think that those beams and columns, well, the beams particularly that frame into the exterior columns, having been welded in most of them in a moment-resisting steel frame building like this, that they would have pulled in on the exterior perimeter steel frame and had massive breaking up of these granite panel cladding system that was all the entire exterior face, as well as the breaking of thousands and thousands of windows and crumpling it like a beer can. It would have happened that way. But that's not what we saw in the video, and we'll take another look at it. In fact, here's the animation from NIST.
Here's our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
Well, the instability starts from floor to ceiling to rooftop on the left side. They're breaking up 400 structural steel connections every second in their computer model. Steel buildings don't fall apart like that. This is like spraying a hose on a sandcastle. It just doesn't work like that in reality. And does it match? Well, let's see. On the left, the actual collapse. On the right, NIST's collapse. The east penthouse, the mechanical penthouse, falls first. And indeed, there's a massive failure on the left side of the building. And then what? It begins to crumple in their computer model like a beer can, looking nothing like the smooth, sudden, symmetrical collapse that we see in the video. They can't even get their computer model, falsify it enough to get it to look like the actual collapse of the building. So we submit a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, which you can do with agencies under the Data Quality Act, agencies that commit fraud like this. And they write back and saying, well, we can't give you the computer input data. We're going to hide that. We're going to keep that to ourselves. Why? It might jeopardize public safety if we were to release that. Wait a minute. Doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold that information from the architects and engineers that are tasked with ensuring the public safety? This is absolutely ludicrous. So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. We have a question. How did the tower come down? We do some background research, make observations. How have other towers come down? We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to what really happened. We don't focus on our favorite hypothesis, but we lay out all the rational hypotheses without favor to those that we might be beholden to due to our financial or political obligations, for instance, like NIST certainly had, being in the federal government, whose leadership was changed out when the Bush administration came into power, along with the leadership of the Department of Commerce, under which NIST operates. So maybe controlled demolition. We'll be looking at evidence for that. These are rational hypotheses given all of the evidence that we have. We make predictions based on these hypotheses and test them with experiments, analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the computer input data from the body of professionals who are demanding it in order to make buildings safe around the world. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis until we find one that is consistent with the experiments, the data, the results, the evidence. So with that in mind, that's what we're about today. And so let's do some background research. How have buildings held up due to fires? Well, fires are certainly a destructive force. It's brought down not steel frame buildings, fireproofed before, but say a wood frame building, because this is an organic, chaotic process. It moves through the building, as we mentioned, in a modern office building every 20 minutes or so. And it burns an area out, in that long and moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. Again, NIST acknowledges that the fires don't last in any particular location for more than that long. But say in skyscrapers, we have a problem here that we haven't lost one, as you'll see. But in wood frame buildings, because the structure itself is flammable, which is why we try to protect wood, but still it can catch on fire. It would fall over in stages to the path of least resistance, following the law of entropy, increasing chaos, disintegration. So, but what about steel frame buildings? Well, we have a test. In fact, the largest test of its kind in the UK in 1995. Let's see what happens here in this 8-story building that they built in order to try to burn it down. Let me make a point here. The steel itself in this test, much of it was fireproofed, as you can see on this particular column, and much of it was not fireproofed, as you see on these particular beams. And they put a massive fuel load in here, as you can see also. So this is an extraordinary test. The worst case, they tried to achieve 2,000-degree fires in here.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse for the first time in history due to fire. So an extraordinary claim that it collapsed due to fire, requiring extraordinary evidence, which we've already begun to see fails immensely. And we haven't even begun to look at what else might have brought these buildings down, but we will. The test shows that the connections do not fail. And yet this is the very focus of NIST's collapse initiation hypothesis, that the connections failed. Even with unprotected beams, we have some warpage, which we might expect. We saw some sagging earlier too, but the executive summary cites that this is inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. So what about other skyscrapers that have had large, long-lasting, and very hot fires?
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17th, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18th, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and neither did these high-rise fires fully engulfing these beams, these buildings after 9/11. We have not lost a steel frame fire protected structure. There have been some mid-rise structures that have collapsed due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. The buildings fall over to the path of least resistance, which we might expect. The concrete, though, is not pulverized to a fine powder. Keep that in mind. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. We recognize the building as a building, and in the aftermath of the destruction, even though it's badly damaged. Keep that in mind. Now, these buildings were exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of expanding cauliflower-shaped form, with pulverized building materials. And this is all due to the incredible heat from the chemical reactions of the explosives themselves. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Now, explosions can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down mid-rise and high-rise buildings, as they have for many, many decades. This is a process called controlled demolition, which only a handful of companies in the United States are even capable of executing. They place shaped cutter charges at key columns and beams in the throughout the building, and then detonate them in a very precise order, tuned to the second, in fraction of a second, mostly. And so there's a set of features associated with these controlled demolitions, which we just want to look at real quick. What are they? We have a sudden onset of destruction. That's typical and very key, usually near the base of the structure. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. That's the idea, to keep the destruction from hurting other buildings. This symmetry is a result of the patterned removal of column supports, which is evident often in the videos, and resulting also in a near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of the greatest structure. The building doesn't tip over, but how does that happen? We'll be looking at that very carefully. Resulting also in the total dismemberment of the steel frame. One column from another is severed. Limited damage to adjacent structures. And of course, that's one of the goals of controlled demolition. Feature number 7, patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. The concrete floors are broken up by the explosives. You don't want to have to go back and jackhammer those floors. So they do that work with the explosives. So there's explosive charges visible at many of the floors, isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry, with chemical evidence of explosive devices left behind in the residue. Hey, if you have these features, you know you have evidence, direct evidence of explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. So this can be a very helpful body of evidence. Also, government documentation, you don't just go and bring down a building, at will. You have to have approval. So governments tend to know about it. So there's foreknowledge in advance of the destruction of these towers. Experts agree, looking at the videos, for instance, that, hey, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. They know a controlled demolition from a natural collapse. With the video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof that we want to apply now to Building 7, beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure? Let's listen to Dan Rather narrate his view of what happened here.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Well, Dan's using his intuition here. He wasn't told what happened. He's just saying, well, we've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas, right? It looks exactly like that. So why wouldn't that be his intuition? The problem is he never used those words or that description again and didn't even show, as other networks did not show, the collapse of Building 7, with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions in the last 20 years. So this is an incredible sweeping under the rug, censoring of this topic, which is a whole nother story. But getting back to the features, do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. In fact, take a look at the mechanical penthouse on top, above the perimeter parapet of this building. Note that the entire penthouse, this is after the east penthouse went down 6 seconds earlier. Now the entire main penthouse and screen wall are dropping within a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building. Now, NIST told us that the collapse started at the east penthouse and gradually worked its way across this football field length building in 6 seconds, gutting the entire building, and then this overall collapse happens. But what you're seeing is that the only way the main penthouse could come down is if the entire structure, the columns underneath it, all were removed at once. This completely pulls the rug out from underneath the NIST report all by itself. So remember, and the building falls into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint. So this is a very, very symmetrical event here. But in case we're not quite seeing this, let's compare side by side. Building 7 on the left, a series of known controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity, at least, to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a fireproofed steel frame skyscraper in history ever? Shouldn't the hypothesis of controlled demolition been the first, if not the only, rational hypothesis? But no, it was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions put up on NIST's website 10 years later. NIST concluded that blast events inside the building did not occur and found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. Later on, we'll show you that they never looked for it. Well, these are the fires that are said to have brought that building down symmetrically. Who's buying this story? Those that aren't looking at the evidence have bought it hook, line, and sinker. And our job is to educate the professionals, the media, the government officials, and the public as to what really happened here. Because what happened at Building 7 is extremely important. It is part of the 9/11 destruction. Its destruction is blamed indirectly on the planes and jet plane impacts and the ensuing fires. Do we have a patterned removal of column supports? Well, how do you get the building to fall symmetrically? You have to remove all of the columns within a second of each other or so. Any deviation in that pattern, the building will begin to tip over. Does fire have that level of precision? These fires? 3,400 architects and engineers think not. How fast is the building coming down? Let's listen to physics teacher David Chandler.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Pardon me? The building fell through its own structure with zero resistance? How does that happen?
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
And one of the reactions is the resistance of the column, which continues to push up even after it is buckling. They call that the plastic stage of a column. It still has at least 25% typically of its strength left, even after it begins to buckle, which would mean that the building would have to slow down because there's 80 columns theoretically all buckling about at once. That's a lot of resistance. So the building can't fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky and buckle all those columns or even one of them. NIST finally admits this because they were challenged publicly by members of AE 9/11 Truth in a press conference. And so in their final report, they acknowledged that, hey, for a third of this building's fall, it came down at free fall. But they don't acknowledge the implications of that, which is clearly that these columns had to have been removed in order to, all of them, in order to achieve free fall. So we're talking to you. Is there the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame? Well, yeah. Here's a 47-story moment-resisting steel frame structure where it is reduced to a pile 4 to 6 stories tall. All the columns and the beams had to have been severed one from another, save the minor substructure supporting the cladding wall that where it looks like it's falling intact. But that's 12 gauge rolled steel or some similar very minor substructure. Remember, buildings that collapse naturally, we don't have severing of columns and beams one from another. They don't fall like a house of cards. Is there limited damage to adjacent structures? Well, yeah, there's some damage actually to the post office and the Verizon building nearby, but the center of the building is in the center of the footprint of the building in the aftermath. Are there sounds of explosions heard by witnesses? Well, let's first go to a statement by Shyam Sunder of NIST.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse, nor reported by witnesses.
Okay, I found this on the web. Is there a limit of damage to it?
She thought he said Siri. Anyway, please turn off your cell phones. Well, let's see if that's true. Here's some witnesses of explosions.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
Shockwave ripping through the building, windows busting out, the sound of a clap of thunder. Did NIST talk to that gentleman interviewed on 1010 Winds Radio? WINS in New York? Or did they talk to this gentleman, Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, who was nearby Building 7?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom, and it's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Did they talk to this gentleman?
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
A flash and then the building coming down? Did they talk to this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, they didn't realize that the building had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. They're on their way back into the building. The elevators didn't work. They're trying to get up to they did get up to the 23rd floor, and they're trying to get down out of the building, and this is their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions. You know,
also the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion, blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
And there's information of bombs. Bombs like this heard in the late morning of 9/11 in the vicinity of Building 7.
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Did NIST talk to those gentlemen? No. Did they talk to the seismic station at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory? Well, they actually did. And it's a fascinating discussion, and I'm going to walk you through it because there was a 0.6 magnitude event near the time of the Building 7 collapse, which NIST claims is a result of the Building 7 collapse. It's a reasonable assumption, but let's look at the data. The peak seismic signal occurs at 5:20 and 42 seconds that evening. But the start of the collapse doesn't happen for 10 seconds later. So how can the collapse cause the seismic signal? Well, NIST has an answer to this. A seismic signal approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of collapse was likely due to the falling of debris from the interior of the collapse. Well, wait a minute. First of all, we saw that the interior structure was supporting, you can see it here, the main penthouse 6 seconds, up to 6 seconds after the east mechanical penthouse falls. But then the entire interior structure falls, which is what they do in controlled demolition. They take out the interior structure a half a second or so before the exterior. That pulls the exterior structure in, on, and over the interior to avoid the building tipping over. So that can't possibly be the cause of the seismic signal because it only begins to happen just a half a second prior to the overall collapse. So what does NIST do? Hold on a second. So we go to Andre Rousseau, who in 2012, an applied geophysics expert, writes another paper. He's written 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves in geology. He says the bell-like forms points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the fall of debris. He says seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin. So this peer-reviewed paper stands uncontested. And so, but let's look at the extreme heat produced here, because we have some real problems with the official story when we go to the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigation. This is the accepted authority in this country and many other countries as well. Look for the large volume of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, these plumes were observable directly after the destruction of Building 7, racing away in every direction, 35 miles an hour. We have these incredible expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes, which are the result of an incredible amount of heat. The heat from the fires in these buildings? No, that heat and those flames were extinguished, most in all likelihood, as a result of the mechanical action of the floors compressing upon each other. No, we're looking for a whole lot more heat. Something on the order of this, and guess what? We find it. Let's go right into it. The NASA air flights, thermal imaging, find incredible heat on the surface of Building 7, which is amounting to about 1,340 degrees after the collapse. Now, the collapse has happened. The fires were extinguished. And yet, on the surface, we have temperatures associated with the very hottest office fires, 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit. So what's happening here? Well, surely something else is going on, which we'll show you evidence for, that's much hotter deep down in the pile, that by the time it rises to the surface has cooled off to 1,340 degrees. And these hot spots are not visible as flames on the surface whatsoever. The fire's gone. Let's listen to Abelhazen Astani Oslo, structural engineer who had a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
I saw the melting of girders in the World Trade Center. Now here he is at the Oakland freeway disaster, a result of a different type of destruction. But he's pointing out that, and documenting with this photograph of WTC7 steel, that the steel melted. Now, guess what? It takes 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to melt steel. The fires weren't even a quarter of those temperatures. So what got to be so hot that it could melt steel? Even as documented by FEMA report author Jonathan Barnett, steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. There's a problem here. It takes 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to evaporate steel. What could have done that? Well, we get a clue actually in the FEMA report, which came out before the NIST report, in their Appendix C, which is a metallurgical examination of the 2002 Building Performance Assessment Team report. What do they document? Never before observed in building fires, eutectic reactions caused intergranular melting capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like they show here. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron, that's molten iron, that's 2,800 degrees. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times. But it was completely eliminated when NIST took over the FEMA report and put out their own report 7 years after 9/11. claiming that no steel could be tested again and again and again and again and again. Couldn't test any steel. No metallography could be carried out because no steel was recovered. And yet, here is John Gross, the co-project leader of the NIST report, on the pile, cutting off the very piece of steel provided to FEMA for their Appendix C metallurgical investigation, in which they documented liquid molten iron invading the ends of the steel beams, like this partially evaporated steel beam. His shadow is all over the evidence. And yet they have no explanation as to how hydrocarbons could burn so hot. Because steel had definitely melted. We've just proven it. FEMA proved it. In fact, you can see by the color of the molten material pouring out of the debris held in the jaws of this crab claw excavator that it's 2,500 degrees. Liquid molten iron, as it turns out to be. They call it molten steel. But what could cause steel or iron to melt? We have some suspecting that fires were 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel doesn't melt until really 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. What could possibly cause this? We'll be looking at one suspect objectively, because we don't have financial or political obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the use of the scientific method. Let's look at the evidence of thermite. Could it have produced all of that molten iron? What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermate were used, it would explain 3 things. One, the incredible temperatures, 4,000 degrees it issues of what? Molten iron. Not molten steel, but molten iron, which we're going to be seeing a lot of evidence for. It would explain the presence of sulfur. Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So we're on to something here. Let's follow it up with a suggestion from the National Fire Protection Association. Look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST claims they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Later, they acknowledge in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residues. You can't find what you will not look for. This is disingenuous at best, but others looked for it. It wasn't that hard to find. Stephen Jones, nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, looked for it. In fact, he was sent samples from this particular piece park of steel that from the sculptor. And he does some analysis here and finds that, gosh, this isn't the kind of cut that thermal lances and oxyacetylene torches do in steel. That looks like this. So we have a real problem with that kind of jagged pattern. That's not how the iron workers were cutting through steel. Something else happened there. Something that does this also. So we have a test of the slag from this beam, and what do we find? We find iron, previously molten iron, manganese, which we'll get to, sulfur, which we've discussed already, aluminum. The ingredients of thermite are iron and aluminum. Usually the aluminum is burned up into aluminum oxide gas. But here's the residue of some incomplete ignition, apparently. So whether the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, does a very detailed study of this dust. In 2006 or 5, they reported in their particle atlas that they find billions of previously molten iron microspheres, billions of them. In fact, 6% of some of these samples are previously molten iron microspheres, up to about 4 tons by extrapolation of all the samples they did find and study, compared to iron dust particles, which can be in common office building dust, but they're not spherical. And we're talking about 150 times more plentiful. R.J. Lee Group, an environmental consulting firm also doing studies on the dust, says that they find these too and document them. They're formed during the event, not before by the welders putting the site together, not afterward by the iron workers taking it apart, but during the event. There's so many of them that they're used to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. In other words, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these previously molten iron microspheres in it. And we don't even know where they came from. They don't speculate where they might have come from. It's a complete mystery to them. But it's not a mystery to those who do thermite experiments like Stephen Jones in his own backyard. A controlled experiment with a very small amount of thermite producing an enormous amount of what? Molten iron spheres, which cool and fall and become spheres. How do they become spheres? Because the surface tension of any aerosolized liquid forms itself into spheres. That's like raindrops. That's how they used to make bullets. They drop lead from a top of a high tower. Anyway, all of these toasted cars could be easily explained by the falling of liquid molten iron microspheres. What other rational explanation in this very high heat event could account for the toasting of the tops of these cars? You can make your own thermite shaped cutter charge in your backyard like John Cole, civil engineer, did. It's got to be shaped, and it's got to be against the steel. And here's what happens. And cutting through the steel. But there are much more effective ways to do this with inventions that are patented. For instance, this thermite-based shaped cutter charge, it can cut through steel of much greater thicknesses, which we had in the World Trade Center, 4-inch slabs of steel at the base of that structure. 3 of them put together, 52 inches by 22 inches at the bottom. Projecting liquid molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds. Much more effective at cutting through these thicker sections of steel. And some of these devices, like this one, the casing itself is made of consumable consolidated thermite, meaning it would burn up too. Nothing left behind but pools of molten iron, which we will see in part 3 of this series, abundant evidence for as well. But for now, what else was found in the World Trade Center dust A team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen is sent independent. They collected independently samples that were sent from various people who heard of their work, like this apartment dweller, Jeanette McKinley, who was an artist, and she collected this dust because it caved in her windows through the incredible explosions that we're going to be looking at next week in this series in the Twin Towers, and filled her office and her apartment full of this dust. And she died, unfortunately, having been breathing and working with it in her therapy as an artist. Very tragic. But one of these dust samples was hers that they documented. They were very curious because they find these red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They thought they were paint at first, but they're attracted by a magnet. So they have a high iron content. They get real curious and zoom into the red layer and do analysis of it with X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy and find what? Iron and aluminum, the key ingredients of unignited thermite. And we'll get to the oxygen, silica, and carbon in a moment. So what are the ingredients of thermite doing in all of these red-gray chips? They get real curious, zoom in 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope and find what? Nano-sized particles of iron oxide crystals, the key ingredient of thermite, 3/4 or so, and 1/4 of which is composed of aluminum platelets. These are at the nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. They're set in a matrix of oxygen, silica, carbon. This is organic material which expands. This is how TNT works with expanding into incredible quantities of gas very fast. Knocks things over. Normally, incendiaries like thermite burn with high temperatures, 4,000 degrees. So here, something else is going on. Something which, interestingly, when put in a differential scanning calorimeter, a heater basically, at about 758 degrees Fahrenheit, they ignite, producing a lot more energy, which can be measured. That's the purpose of this device, proving that it's an exothermic reaction. And what do they produce when they ignite? They produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust by R.J. Lee and USGS and so forth. So we know where those molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips. As if we didn't know, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is a very sophisticated process documented by Lawrence Livermore Lab called super thermite to increase the weapon capability of our arms industry. So it's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. And so we've got a source, if we can get, of experimentally reproducible, self-corroborating set of evidence that can be used to bring the perpetrators of 9/11, the real perpetrators, to justice. If we can get it into a court of law, and we have been trying, as we will show you. This is all documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It stands uncontested. No one has, people will raise their hand and say, oh, that's just paint. No, nobody has submitted their own peer-reviewed paper documenting the analysis of these red-gray chips to prove anything else other than what has been proven in this document. So what we've been looking at here with regard to Building 7 so far is key characteristic features of controlled demolition. A fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Why not? Well, let's look at it real quick. Modern steel reinforced high-rise that are fireproofed have never collapsed due to an uncontrolled fire. Why? Well, one reason is steel conducts that heat away from the source. So it never gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which point steel can begin to fail, begin to bend, and loses half of its strength. But keep that from happening anyway, we go ahead and fireproof it with 2 and 3 hour fire protection on the beams and the columns. And that's what Building 7 was protected with, and the Twin Towers. And to keep that from fire from ever becoming a problem, we of course create our high rises, build them out of non-combustible materials, and we don't allow the tenants to bring in large fuel loads. We also require sprinklers to be installed, and sprinklers in the case of Building 7 were said to have been put in test mode the morning of 9/11, which is very interesting. Nevertheless, they were non-operational. They also said that when the towers collapsed, that damaged the main, the fire sprinkler main, the water main. So that's arguable. So we don't argue it. We argue the evidence for controlled demolition here at AE 9/11 Truth. And we look at the FEMA reports. There was an investigation into Building 7 in 2002. FEMA had only $600,000, but their efforts were quite hampered. They had bureaucratic restrictions. They couldn't get data, basic data like the blueprints of the buildings, making forensic inspections, getting crucial information. FEMA wouldn't refuse to let the team appeal to the public for photographs and videos. And this was documented in the New York Times. In 2008, NIST had taken over this investigation, ejected the building, the Appendix C metallurgical examination that we looked at earlier, and came up with their stated conclusion, even before they started, that fires caused these collapses. Even after acknowledging in 2006 that we've had a trouble getting a handle on Building 7. Yeah, you did. You ignored completely the report that essentially shows and proves that the ends of the beams were attacked by a hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel. They say in FEMA, further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve the issue. How did the building come down? But unfortunately, for those hoping to resolve that issue, the evidence from Building 7 was and easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, carted away at a rate of 400 truckloads per day after just 2 weeks, put on these barges, sent to China for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't, prompting experts like Danny Jawenko to offer their own solicited opinion on the spot.
Danny Jawenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
And Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus at the Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering Institute. In my opinion, the building, World Trade Center 7, was with great probability professionally demolished. And Kamal obeyed. structural engineer, a localized failure in a steel frame building like WTC7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. And we have hired one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Hulsey of the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, and his team of PhD students to engage in a 4-year, $300,000 study of what really happened to this building. So they looked carefully at the problem, because no other tall steel frame building had ever failed due to fire. So they have to ensure that the public safety, that the failure mechanism of the structure be understood. So they examined the response of the building to the fire loads that NIST used. They ruled out scenarios that would not cause the collapse, and they tried to identify the types of failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. They used the same input data as made available here and there by NIST. They had 3 approaches: to simulate the local structural responses, to examine the NIST collapse initiation hypothesis, and to simulate numerous failure scenarios. So this data was available, and it was put into AutoCAD first, and then the Abacus software was compared head-to-head with the SAP 2000 software models. They focused on the area of concern that NIST had, with the same pushing of the girder off of its seat. And they found, by the way, it couldn't be pushed off because it was trapped by these side plates. After this beam heats up and expands a little bit, it becomes trapped. They found that NIST lied about the 30 shear studs not being there. The shop drawings show that they were indeed there. They lied, they found, about the stiffeners that we talked about. They lied about the amount of required force to break the girder connections below the 12th floor that we talked about. They lied about the direction of the movement of the structural forms, because in their computer model, NIST made this exterior wall infinitely stiff. So everything had to move inward. But the exterior wall is not infinitely stiff. In fact, it's a lot less stiffer than the interior of the structure. So actually it moved out. So the entire scenario that NIST painted is fraudulent from beginning to end, but that claim is not made. It's just demonstrated by the University of Alaska. Their approach is the findings that they overestimated the wall rigidity. The movements were from west to east at column 79, not east to west. And the movement at the column seat was in the opposite direction. They found that NIST's assumptions were that the shear connections on several beams were broken. They were not. The bolts fastening the girder to its seat were broken, but they were found that they were not. They found that columns 79, 80, and 81 did not fail, as NIST claimed would have failed. But if they could have failed, guess what would have happened? The building would have tipped over, which is intuitive, right? This is 7th grade physics. The building tips over if the columns on that side of the building fail. So it was a global failure is what the University of Alaska found, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns throughout the building, but a global failure, as you see in their final model here. It looks, this one actually does look exactly like the collapse of the video of the collapse of Building 7. So they find that fire did not cause the collapse of Building 7. The temperature was not high enough to cause weakening of the steel framing. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and the girders. And WTC7 did not experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns within a second of each other or so. So when you put together these models, on the left, the University of Alaska, on the right, the model of NIST, which actually begins to look like the building failure as shown in the videos. And in fact, I forgot to mention that the NIST video stops 2 seconds after the overall collapse starts. Why do they stop it? They had years to create this model. Well, it begins to tip over. It would look nothing like Building 7 model. They can't even get their own computer model to falsified enough to appear similar to the video of the collapse. But now it gets even more interesting because we look at foreknowledge of the destruction, because if this was set up as a controlled demolition, people would know, like this person, an engineer, who's asked by the chief, if we allow it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse and how soon? Well, the engineer said 5 hours. In its current state, you have about 5 hours. What? A steel frame skyscraper has never collapsed due to fire alone, and now you're predicting that this one's going to collapse in 5 hours? And it does? This can only be made, this prediction, with foreknowledge of the building. Foreknowledge, which we're going to look at some more evidence of as we look at these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Move it back. All right, guys? Sorry.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down.
What? The building is about to blow up? Flame and debris coming down? How do they know? What's going on here? Here's Kevin McPadden, who we heard witness of explosions after something happened. What was that something? He's held back maybe 6 blocks away from Building 7 with the yellow tape. He's listening to a radio held in the hand of a Red Cross worker. What does he hear?
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
And then, in a couple of seconds, the explosions happen, as he testified earlier. Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's really going on here? And how does the BBC announce the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it even happened?
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. Take a look at this announcement of the collapse of Building 7 just after the Twin Towers collapsed.
In New York, Alan Dobbs-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon.
Wait a minute. This is 15 minutes or so after the Twin Towers came down. If Building 7 would have gone down at that time, we wouldn't even have any videos of it because of the massive dust clouds which consumed Lower Manhattan from when the Twin Towers came down. Maybe it was supposed to come down at that time. Maybe those mysterious construction workers were going back into Building 7 because it didn't come down at that time. and they were fixing a dud. That's all speculation. But here's what Larry Silverstein says, who's interviewed a year after 9/11 about Building 7.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Wait a minute. They made the decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. Well, pull it is a term used in the controlled demolition industry for pulling a building, bringing it down by explosive demolition. And firefighters don't make decisions to pull buildings. And Silverstein says, oh, I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building. But the firefighters made the decision early on not to attempt to fight the fires, due in part because of the damage that they said was there as a result of the collapsing towers. So he couldn't have meant the firefighters. They weren't even in the building fighting the fire. No manual firefighting operations were even taken by the FDA. So how can you pull them? They were concerned about structural damage. That was the story on the street. So they didn't go in. Well, what have we learned today using the scientific method? Is the hypothesis of fire corroborated by the evidence, or is controlled demolition corroborated by the evidence? Have we shown 10 key characteristic and many uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition? Is that, to you, direct evidence of destruction with explosives? Can fire create any one of those features, let alone all of them? Is there additional circumstantial corroborative testimony that proves controlled demolition? Well, we want to know the answer from you. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions. Also, Andy, what do we have? We have questions today, and how do people ask them?
Yeah, we already got 3. We could use some more. So please submit any questions that you might have in the input form that we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education, select the live webinars, and we'll do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we'll tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree the evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Thank you. And that form is right there. And while you're there, please subscribe to our email newsletter. It goes out a couple of times a month. We give you the latest evidence that we're collecting, the latest progress toward getting a real investigation. So stay tuned with us. Fill that out and get informed on our website. We have an incredible evidence section of our website packed with all kinds of video and technical papers and efforts we're making toward exposing what really happened. Sign the petition also. There's 20,000 people supporting the more than 3,400 architects and engineers that are signed on to the petition. So please join them. It's a great opportunity to take a public stand, especially if you are an architect or engineer, and donate to our very important work of exposing the truth about 9/11. You can do that online here, and you can become a member, support our operations. We have 6 employees who are working full-time to get the word out. And for as little as a cup of coffee a month, you can join the family of sustaining supporters. So please do that too. And if you can't do any of that, you can certainly volunteer with your efforts and your skills. Andy, how do people do that?
Yeah, easiest way is go to ae911truth.org. There's a form right on there. It's very short, very easy to fill out, and we'll get in touch with you. I'll be calling 2 this afternoon. but we can always use more. So look, if you have any time during the week, if you have any energy and that you want to put into this issue, it's so important. That's why you're here. That's why you're watching this. A lot of you every single week, then do consider volunteering. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and the more people helping us out with it, the better. So please consider doing that.
Yes, and that's there's so many different ways that you can, a writing team or web team or presenters team, outreach team, translation team, the verification of our architects and engineers, all that's available and needs lots of help. You can contact your own, just on your own, sitting in your chair at home, do volunteer work without us even knowing about it. Contact your elected representatives, television, radio, newspapers. Share the AE911truth.org link to every architect and engineer you can find and everybody else that you know. Share our DVDs and screen them. Bring your friends over. Give them to architects and engineers in your community. We have brochures that give all this evidence, and you can buy them $10 for 100 of them and pass them out. Get people looking at this evidence. And you can download the actual results of the 4-year, $300,000 study from the University of Alaska and share that with structural engineers, or just read it. Go to WTC Evaluation. That's WTC7evaluation.org. And we've made a movie about this important finite element analysis. And this is the story of Leroy Halsey. And it's a great film that presents the works of his efforts, he and his team. And you can share this with others. It's available on our website, in our store, and it's also, you can see it on Amazon.com. And we're getting ready to sue NIST, actually, because they have not responded to our appeal to their denial of our request for correction. And we're putting the screws to them, so you can help us. We went through all this material today, and we put it now legally in a 100-page request for correction, which they have yet to respond to adequately. We also want you to know that you can make an appointment with your congressperson. How does that work, Andy? We're actually going to go and give the presentation to your congressman for you. Isn't that right?
That's right. The one good thing about this terrible ordeal that we've been through for the past, since 2020, is the fact that Congress now will meet more people over the phone. So we have to take advantage of that. And the way you do that is to figure out first who your congressman is. Some people don't know. And then go to their own congressional page and find the box for setting up a meeting, doing a meeting request. And all of them have that in some form or another. So you make a request and say that you want to talk about the Bobby McIlvaine Act, which we'll talk about in just a moment. We're also going to be doing some action regarding the request for correction that the clock is still ticking on NIST to give an adequate response to. So all of those things need to be discussed with Congress, but we're in our own districts, and there's a lot of congressmen out there. They care mostly about their constituents and staying elected. So that's why you're so important. So you make that request. If you need any help doing it or have any questions about it, you can write to Congress at AE911truth.org. We'll help you do it. We keep track of it, and we go on the meeting with you. Most of the time, Richard is there and makes the presentation. You can participate and ask questions or make the requests of your staffer or congressman when they're on the phone as well. So it's great action, and it's actually not that hard to do, just a little bit of effort. So please consider doing it. And of course, it's about the Bobby McIlvaine Act. This is draft legislation that would set up a select committee in Congress to reinvestigate, or actually to do a real investigation of the destruction of these 3 towers, what Richard has been talking about all of these years. And it's written in such a way that they can't just spit out talking points from NIST and call it a day. They actually have to look into this evidence. And of course, it's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed as he was entering the lobby of the North Tower. So it really brings home why this is so important for not just you, because you already know that, but for your congressman as well. So please get involved and learn more about it at ae911truth.org/justice.
Yes, and speaking of justice, we have submitted 60 exhibits. The Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry did anyway, of our evidence and other evidence to the Manhattan U.S. Attorney, and we have sued them to prove that they actually provided that to a special grand jury as they were compelled by law to do. And so we await the results of that and the FBI lawsuit, which is an extraordinary effort at forcing the FBI to give the evidence that they have of ours, which they have admitted having and commented on it positively, actually, and as they were required to do by Congress in 2015 with the 2015 9/11 Review Commission. 9/11 Commission Review. So that's pending. And we also have an effort in the grand effort by 5 courageous fire commissioners to demand a new investigation. A universal, a complete unanimous vote for a resolution demanding a new investigation there. He says, you better believe when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. And we also have one more item for you before we get to your questions here. And this is the documentary, landmark documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, which we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence for you that we've only begun to scratch the surface of here. And here's just a couple of minutes to give you a sense of how powerful film can be. In making your case.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
all the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
No, and that's why we put this evidence together in the 1 hour version, which is free on YouTube for everybody to see. And the 90-minute version is available on our website, along with a free documentary or additional interview footage of the Meet the Experts, all 40 of them and more. So be sure to take advantage of the DVD itself. And then you can download for free the 50-page booklet, Beyond Misinformation, from beyondmisinformation.org. You can also purchase the coffee table quality version of this booklet, and which goes through, completely pulls the rug out from underneath NIST and exposes them and points out our evidence as well that they omitted and censored and so forth. The classic version of our 2-hour lecture, Blueprint for Truth, is available free on YouTube, as is the 15-minute documentary on Building 7, Solving the Mystery. So with that, let's jump into questions. Andy.
Okay, our first question asks, do you know if it was fire insurance that paid for Building 7's destruction or if all 3 buildings were insured for acts of terrorism? CNN reported Building 7 had collapsed only a few minutes after the North Tower, and that would have been before any fire could have started in Building 7.
Yeah, 2 separate questions here. I believe that it's terrorist insurance because the Building 7 was taken down by indirectly by terrorism, even though it was fire also. That's a great question, though. I never considered if fire insurance was used to pay for the rebuilding of 7. Do you have any thoughts on that, Andy?
Well, I looked it up a little bit. We all know that Larry got money and he tried to sue for 2 separate acts of terrorism when, in the aftermath, and he got a lot of money and from the insurance companies. There's not a lot that I have found regarding the specific insurance policy on Building 7. My understanding of it is that unless there's an exclusion for terrorism in the policy, that the terrorism would be covered by the insurance. And so, you could say, yeah, it was insured for terrorism. And of course, putting aside everything we're talking about right now, if you're owning any buildings in the World Trade Center complex, considering the history, you would want to have insurance for terrorism on it. So yeah, terrorism would have been covered, but I can't find a lot of stuff about exactly how Building 7 itself was covered. Mostly the articles focus on the Twin Towers.
Gotcha. Yeah, and he walked away with $5.68 billion. So two acts of terrorism. Plus, he tried to sue the airlines, which he failed for destroying his buildings. And that was afterward, which is interesting. Anyway, the other question, CNN reported Building 7 had collapsed only a few minutes after the North Tower. We showed you that clip that said a firefighter raced by and said a 50-story building went down. Well, that was just 15 minutes after the towers had gone down. So the interesting thing here that's being speculated, this is before any fire was even in Building 7, because those fires were only observed after noon or about noon. So the question, the implied question here is, what is the implied question? Help me with this, Andy. This is very interesting, and I'm not quite grabbing it.
Sure. And if we don't answer it to the satisfaction of the questioner here, they can always write to us at info@ae911truth.org. We answer questions. CNN reported Building 7 had collapsed only a few minutes after the North Tower, and that would have been before any fire could have started in Building 7. I mean, that would definitely be something that would be a point of evidence. I think that's what they're just trying to bring up as a point.
It's foreknowledge, clearly.
Yeah.
One of several examples of foreknowledge of Building 7 is supposed to have come down before it actually did. I don't know that it answers or abuts or bolsters the fire insurance claim. Probably removes it altogether, I would imagine.
Right. And if we're not explaining it well enough, then please write to us and give us a little bit more of the point and what you're asking there. The next question asks, in the request for corrections to NIST, is there a request to explain the cause of free fall in the NIST Building 7 graph? And I'm going to address that first. Not quite. There are two basic requests. One is to accurately describe the sudden transition to free fall. Currently, NIST is trying to say the transition to free fall is gradual, and also to produce a model that replicates the observed behavior, including free fall.
Yeah. So yes, it certainly does, and it's a good read for some 100 pages. But the building cannot possibly fall at free fall for a third of its 7-second fall, which NIST admits, and at the same time have columns buckling. Those columns had to have been removed in order for free fall to happen. I mean, all 80 of them removed completely, because if any columns were buckling, they would have provided, as I mentioned, a minimum of 25% resistance against that fall, which means the building would have decelerated, not accelerated at free fall acceleration.
Okay, our last question asks, has anyone ever pushed NIST about the explosion that can very faintly be heard at the 2-second mark of the original WTC7 collapse video from West Street right before the penthouse collapses? Headphones are needed.
Now, is that the same explosions heard in the video that's analyzed by David Chandler, which he did an audio analysis of? It may or may not be. But I don't know if NIST has ever been pushed on that. We didn't include that in the request for correction. Did we, Andy?
Not that I know of. If there's ever anything that anyone catches out there that we've missed, certainly send it to us and give us a quick explanation, of what you're seeing here. And we certainly look at this every single week and see if there's any new points of evidence that we can add to this large canon of evidence of controlled demolition.
Yeah, if headphones are needed to hear an explosion, and they are, because the explosions are not picked up well on audio, and we keep hearing, oh, there's no explosions on any of the audio. Well, there are, but they take some work and analysis to prove and show, which has been done. This particular one, has it been done? I don't know. The one I'm referring to is the explosion, which reporter Ashley Banfield turns around very quickly, looking at WTC7, and says, oh no, it's begun, because they were kind of expecting it to come down. But she's surprised by an explosion, as were 3 or 4 others, which we played their eyewitness testimony to you earlier today. But if you need headphones to pick it up on the audio recordings, I just don't find that as compelling evidence. And we've already gone 2 hours on this, just on building 7. So we don't want to add in a lot of the evidence and make it a 6-hour presentation, because we could, believe me. But we've taken the best, what I feel is the best, the cream of the crop of evidence that's hardcore, that nobody can deny. So, but still, it's a good question. And thank you.
Okay, that's it for questions, but I'm going to ask the audience to help me out a little bit here, because I was looking at Facebook comments. I only see 5 of them, but it says we have way more than that, 40, but I can only see 5, and one actually disappeared as I was reading it. So I didn't do that. So if you can, go to our Facebook page and let me know how many actual comments you see, not the comment number, but the actual comments you see, and you can write to us at info@ae911truth.org. That would help us a lot over here. But that is it for questions. So thank you for watching today.
Yes, thanks everybody. And part 1, and thanks Andy in particular, is what we looked at today. This is a 3-part series though. Next week we'll dive into the explosive destruction of the towers. So join us for the overview of evidence that will convince anybody. And I mean literally anybody who's willing to look at the evidence for this period of time. They are convinced. We've done this presentation around the world in over 700 times now in 23 different countries. And in 99% of cases, we get virtually everybody asking for a new investigation. People who believe the official story coming in to the presentation, because we do this show of hands. And then after that, we'll get to part 3. And thanks though for now, and we'll let you go. And thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks, Andy. And we'll catch up with you next week, Thursday, 1 p.m. Pacific. Bye for now.